Okay, so welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land in which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our speaker today, Katherine Mair, is a historian specialising in the court art of the early modern period. Her PhD thesis, recently submitted for examination at the University of Newcastle, is titled Power and Protection in Portraits of Spanish Royalty Alongside People with Dwarfism. Her paper today is drawn from this thesis and is titled The Power of the Diminutive in Early Modern Spain. Over to you, Kath.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you, Ryan, for inviting me to participate in the History at Newcastle seminar series today. I'm very excited to be here. So just bear with me for a second. I need to share my screen, and we've just been talking about technology hiccups, and hopefully you can all see that okay. Is that correct? Have I got a thumbs up? Brilliant. Yep. Awesome. So as Sasha mentioned, my work is particularly focused on the court art of Spain. And ultimately, really, I am an art historian in terms of my background and my early studies. I have been particularly interested for a very long time in how and why people with dwarfism came to be represented alongside members of the Habsburg royal family in the court of Spain in the 16th and 17th century. Images, cultural objects, and works of art are therefore really central to my work. And today I thought I would share some of my insights or some of the insights from my research, but also invite you to consider or even reconsider the way we look at and examine visual evidence. So with that in mind, I'd actually like to start today by asking you a couple of questions focused on the picture that you're looking at on the screen. And so we're only a small group today, so please feel free to come off mute. But what is it that you see when you look at this picture?
So I'll start.
Thank you, Philip. Awesome.
We have a child who takes the center, and the light seems to be focused on her, surrounded by what I assume to be ladies in waiting. And to her left, what might be described somewhat pejoratively are her pets, that is the dog and what looks like a court dwarf. And in the background, we have religion symbolized by the nun. And right at the back, there's a painting, obviously, of possibly her parents just beside the door. But right at the back, there's a gentleman about to climb up the stairs, but difficult to say what he represents or who he might be. Obviously, people at the time might know better. And they're in front of a painting, which we can't see, which is to the left of us. That's my quick take.
That's fantastic, Philip. Have you seen this picture before?
I have come across it. Now, this is a Goya, is that right?
No.
No, it's a bit, oh, sorry.
But you're very close, though, and I'll reveal that shortly. But so you have seen it before. Anyone else got any?
I do 18th century, so, and I have done a little bit on Spain, so I've seen these paintings before. Yep.
Fantastic. Anyone else got any observations that they'd like to share about what you see when you look at this picture?
I'm always amused by the way in which artists will insert themselves into the a painting. And not only is he present, but also the sheer number of artworks that are lining the walls and otherwise stationed about the place, I think is always a little bit of shameless advertising, maybe.
I love that, Sasha. Fantastic. Anyone else got any observations or thoughts or even questions perhaps about this picture? Ryan, I'm going to throw it to you, see if you've got anything you'd like to layer in.
Well, I'm just here for the show, so.
So we've already got some really interesting observations emerging Sasha commented on, the fact that the artist has thrown himself in the picture, and we've got a whole bunch of pictures on the wall. Is that sort of a little bit of advertisement for his wares? Philip's commented on a whole range of things, including the so-called grouping of pets in the front corner, the fact that we've got a picture that we can't see, the way in which lighting has been used. We've got an enigmatic figure in the back doorway. So what does all of this mean? And so when we think about pictures, there's so many different ways that we can interpret them. And this particular picture is truly an enigma. This picture is called or known as Las Meninas. Las Meninas is the Portuguese word for maids. So, Philip, when you commented on the ladies in waiting, that's exactly who that is referring to. Or it's otherwise known as the family of Philip IV. It was painted in 1656 by Don Diego de Silva Velázquez, who was first painter to the king and had been for decades. It actually depicts the king's daughter, the Infanta Margarita, born by his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who also happened to be his niece. The tiny Infanta is surrounded by her entourage, which included Velázquez himself, and they appear in the artist's studio, which were once, in fact, the apartments of the princess's older half-brother, Balthasar Carlos, who had been heir to the throne before his untimely death some 10 years earlier. Contemporary Spanish painter, theorist and historian Antonio Palomino, towards the end of the 17th century, obligingly identified most of the figures in this entourage, including from left to right, Diego Velázquez, Doña María Agustina Sarmiento de Sotomayor, the menina who is kneeling, Margarita in the centre, Doña Isabel de Velasco, the menina on the other side. Here across in the front plane, Maria Barbola, the woman with dwarfism, alongside Nicolásito Portusato. In the middle ground behind them is Doña Marcela de Ulloa. She was actually a lady in waiting and dressed in the habit of a nun, which signifies that she was a widow. Unidentified, the only unidentified figure here in this picture is the guardadama or bodyguard who stood beside her. In the back doorway is José Nieto Velázquez. He was the aposentador or the chamberlain for the Queen's household. And in what Philip identified as a painting on the back wall, which incidentally has also been identified as a mirror and is the topic of enormous amounts of debate, we see reflected really a portrait or an image of the king and the queen. If you're puzzling over the image, rest assured you are not alone. It is an extremely unusual painting for many, many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that it is a group portrait, which stands in stark contrast to the simple and incredibly standardized formats of Royal Habsburg portraiture throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. The incredibly austere and understated nature of the Habsburg image, notoriously shunning overt regal symbols like orbs, scepters, thrones, and crowns, is also something that we sort of see as something that stands in contrast, or the picture stands in contrast to the typically austere nature of the Habsburg image. Excuse me, please. In the art of Spain at the time, such a large multi-figure portrait was truly unique. And to your point earlier, Philip, and that association made with Goya was absolutely spot on. And it's because we don't see anything like Las Meninas until Goya actually paints the family of Carlos IV in 1800, nearly 150 years later. The composition and positioning of the figures is also incredibly informal. The sense that the figures were caught in a moment has seen it compared to a photographic snapshot, characterizing it as extraordinarily modern in approach and sensibility. The artist leans back from his easel to turn attention to an outside interruption or perhaps examine the sitter for the picture he is in the middle of painting. The princess herself and Doña María Agustina Sarmiento, they gaze furtively out of the picture as though something has just caught their attention. All the while, Doña Marcela de Ulloa and her guardadama continue to chatter quietly in the background, and seemingly oblivious to everyone is little Nicolásito gently nudging the mastiff with his boot. So we have the cast, We can generally describe what they are doing, but what does it all really mean? Especially in the context of 17th century Spain and the practice of royal image making. The image has proven to be an enduring enigma for scholars seeking to unlock the meaning and significance behind its creation. In fact, there has been more written on this one image than Velázquez himself might ever have imagined. Curiously, and despite the voluminous literature on this painting, very little has been written about the two figures with dwarfism who feature so prominently in the foreground. Maria Barbara exhibits the most recognizable and common form of restricted growth known as achondroplasia, while Nicolásito had a form of proportionate dwarfism. In the many erudite discussions, the figures are barely, if ever, mentioned at all on this painting. Alice McVan's characterization of them as incidental and minor figures in a canvas filled with action reflects a broader tendency to marginalize such individuals in discussions of the artworks in which they appear. Yet people with dwarfism or restricted growth featured repeatedly in royal portraits in Habsburg Spain, and such images belong to a wider oeuvre of Habsburg portraiture designed to assert dynastic claims to authority, stability, and longevity. These figures began to appear alongside regal sitters in Spanish Habsburg portraits in the latter decades of the 16th century. It was an innovation led by Philip II's first painter, Alonso Sánchez Coello, around 1585, with two depictions, one of the Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia with Magdalena Ruiz, and the other a portrait of the Duchess of Beja. This was a perplexing but important development when considered in relation to the distinct dynastic image cultivated by the Spanish Habsburgs, and my PhD sought to explain why these figures were introduced to Habsburg royal portraits and what they symbolized in the context of a dynastic image informed by principles of elegant simplicity, modesty, and verisimilitude. With no need for orbs, scepters, or crowns, and eschewing complex symbolism in their portraits, I argue that the figure with dwarfism was a carefully selected addition to the Habsburgs' distinct dynastic image. Their seemingly humble figure embodied a rich symbolism that was fitting with the stoic and remarkably consistent image of this powerful dynasty. Moreover, many of the royal portraits where these figures appear were painted around especially important times for the monarchy, like the betrothal and marriage of a princess, a first pregnancy, a yet-to-be consummated marriage, introduction of a fledgling heir to the throne, or the cavernous space echoing sadly with the loss of that heir. My research has contextualized the appearance of the dwarfed figure in royal portraits in relation to periods where there existed growing concerns relating to succession and preoccupations with securing an heir. This also helps explain the important role they played in these pictures, underscoring assurances of dynastic stability and continuity, symbolically protecting the royal bloodline. Habsburg portraits played an important role in marking the royal presence across their vast empire. In the absence of the person themselves, the portrait was accorded the same significance as if they were present. Yet the act of looking, especially gazing too intently, was inherently dangerous because, as Covarrubias reported, someone could do wrong just by casting their eyes on another. This is known as the evil eye or fascination. Fueled by envy and comprising an interconnected set of ideas, it was premised on the notion that one can inflict serious, even irreparable harm through the act of looking, and was seen to be a real threat to life. In the opening pages of his treatise on fascination, Enrique de Aragon, Marqués de Villena, stated that up to the present, let it be clear to you that many philosophers and great scholars spoke of the evil eye, derived from eojar, which in Latin we say fascinar. Widespread, this belief complex can be found throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian cultures. It has especially deep roots in the Mediterranean countries like Spain, where Madame Delaunay, recounting in her travels, noted that they are here, that is in Spain, strongly persuaded there are persons who can do you hurt by bare looking on you, and here are even churches to which they go in pilgrimage to be cured of it. In addition to being attracted to youth and beauty, envy and the evil eye were especially attracted to those with status, wealth, and abundance. The risk of fascination was especially acute around the time of marriage and its consummation, which typically involved the exchange, consolidation, or expansion of property, as well as the promise of offspring. It also targeted individuals at vital yet vulnerable stages of life, including pregnancy, birth, and infancy, all events brimming with possibility, yet fraught with the increased risk of injury, loss, or death in early modern society. Furthermore, this deeply feared phenomenon was considered particularly pernicious at public events, which were often ostentatious displays of wealth, celebrating the status of those in power. The evil eye was therefore especially potent in places like the court because of the obvious affluence, privileged position, and authority of prominent people were conspicuous targets. Accordingly, it was necessary to install mechanisms where royal portraits appeared to protect the subject of the image and the space where it was hung. Believed to possess the power to avert the evil eye and carrying associations with mystical powers and fertility since antiquity, my research posits that the figure with dwarfism was installed as an apotropaic element in Habsburg portraits to protect the sitter and the space where their image appeared from fascination, and played a potent role in bolstering messages about monarchic stability and dynastic continuity. Unifying the myriad strategies to avoid, deflect, or nullify fascination was the necessity to distract the gaze of the would-be fascinator and break their line of sight. The natural difference of people with dwarfism framed them as especially potent in this regard because their non-normative form unfailingly attracted the gaze. Small amulets like the Roman bronze here were designed to be carried on one's person in precisely this protective capacity. They were so widespread that they still exist in large numbers in the collections of major museums today. These figures were often depicted in aggressive stances and wielding weapons like spears. The mosaic from the House of the Evil Eye provides a vivid illustration of evil eye lore, bringing this enigmatic belief into plain sight. There, the motif of the dwarfed figure was combined with other potent amulets and talismans, including the fascinum or phallus, aggressive animals like the corvid, scorpion, snake, dog, centipede, and panther, as well as sharp instruments like the sword and trident piercing the much-suffering eye, as well as the sticks held by the small figure. Compositionally, it is the small figure with dwarfism who attracts the gaze, something reinforced by his enormous phallus. The placement of other apotropaia around the much-suffering eye in the centre draw the viewer's gaze into a circular loop, bouncing around and around the image. This is reinforced by the undulating waves around the mosaic's border. Together, they propel the eye into never-ending motion, never allowing it to rest. This is a fundamental notion underpinning evil eye lore. First, one had to distract and attract the gaze, hence the dwarf figure, and then we needed to confuse and disorientate the fascinator, hence the oscillating movement inherent in the composition. Furthermore, underpinning evil eye lore and associated cultural practice was the homeopathic principle of simila similibus, matching like with like. The phrase above the small man's head in the Antioch mosaic reinforces this. Kai si means and you, or the same to you. In other words, the fearsome nature of the evil eye could be turned upon the evil eye itself, and its intense, fiery, sharp quality could be harnessed to repel it. Indeed, symbolic parallels between piercing weapons and a piercing gaze have endured since antiquity to the current day. Madame Delaunay's description of the eyes of a fascinator is full of such a shining vivacity that they seem to be all on fire and would make one think they will pierce you like a dart, echoed that of Plutarch, who described the strange fiery power of the eyes, which when fueled by envy could send out as it were poisoned darts. Just as the eyes of a fascinator seemed to be all on fire, the eye of the dwarfed figure enacted a thorough counterattack as though they too could pierce you like a dart. It is no coincidence that the small-statured attendant here was shown here staring down the viewer and holding a spear and sword, both symbolic objects underscoring and reinforcing his symbolically protective power. Importantly, and for our purposes today, reading royal portraits through the lens of evil eye lore fundamentally changes the way we look at and understand these images and the court environment for which they were created. Today, I'd like to take you on a sojourn through some of these fascinating pictures, pardon the pun, and share with you the way in which I have used images and cultural objects in my research. While my research has examined hundreds of images, today we will dive into just a select few. Our first stop is the picture of the inaugural picture featuring a small-statured person in the oeuvre of Habsburg royal portraits, which shows the Infanta Isabel Clara Eugenia, the eldest daughter of Philip II, alongside her attendant Magdalena Ruiz. At first glance, this image seamlessly aligns with Habsburg portrait conventions, which were designed to subtly but surely craft a perception of unwavering dynastic stability and power through compositional consistency and the repeated use of a relatively limited array of visual inclusions, like the rug at the Infanta's feet or the Doric column by her mother's side, for example. The overall similarities between the portrait of the princess and her mother are striking. The upright pose and positioning of the arms, the elegant but not overly ostentatious attire, and the indeterminate or unidentifiable space, for example. Both women also hold a cameo depicting Philip II, father of Isabel Clara Eugenia and husband of Isabel de Valois. This device did not simply link the Infanta visually to her mother, but underscored both women's links to the king, emphasizing their place in the dynasty and bolstering the perception of their status as a result. Such compositional similarities in devices ran even deeper, extending back to the Infanta's aunt Juana of Portugal and her grandfather, the Emperor Carlos V. This was reinforced through the gesture of resting a regal hand on a servile head, a convention established in this early image of the emperor by Titian and emulated for generations to come. However subtle, it was an important gesture laden with symbolism relating to fidelity and protection, and the inherent exchange of these factors between vassal and ruler. There were other signs, too, of the enduring nature of Habsburg power as grounded in the vastness of their empire. The cotton-topped tamarind and white-mantled tamarind held by Magdalena Ruiz came from the Amazon and operated as distinct imperial symbols of the geopolitical reach of the Spanish Empire. The cameo representing Philip II, bit like a Roman Caesar, also made clear these allusions to empire. Even the cameo's positioning at the center of the image mark the absolute centrality of a king across his kingdom, in his kingdom from which all else expanded. El imperio donde nunca se pone el sol. The Spanish Empire was always referred to as the empire upon which the sun never set. All of this reflects the imperial and dynastic importance of the image. But what of the figure of Magdalena? How does she contribute to the symbolism of such pictures? As the only other figure alongside the Infanta, she was undeniably important. It is her rosary made of coral which underscored Magdalena's role as a protective apotropaic element in the picture. Coral was the highly valued amuletic substance believed effective in combating fascination. Anselmus Botes de Boot, physician to Emperor Rudolf II, reported in his History of Stones and Gems that coral is famously an amulet against dangers, fascinations, charms. And it was common for red coral to become pale, livid, and stained with spots while it was worn by near death or the dangerously ill. Yes, it shows future disease by changing colour. In a curious yet common practice, these kinds of rosaries often had other talismans attached to them to fortify their protective powers, as seen in the specimen here. Coral was deemed particularly efficacious during pregnancy, childbirth, and infancy, and its perceived protective and prophylactic powers against fascination were also reported by contemporary Spanish authors, including Covarrubias, Ruiz de Fonseca, Álvarez Chanca, and Enrique de Aragon. These authors were reflecting ancient practices where branches of coral hung at the neck of infants as a preservative against danger. The adaptation of such practices in the Christian era vividly illustrated the depictions of the era was vividly illustrated in depictions of the Virgin and Child, where it was not unusual to find Jesus holding a coral rosary or wearing a coral amulet, as seen in the images here. In such images, the coral was a symbolic inclusion which emphasized the humanity and passion of Christ and acknowledged that, like any infant, he too needed protection in the vulnerable stages of life. Not only did the Spanish Habsburg royal family possess the aforementioned religious images, the same practices were evidenced in representations of their own children. In the portrait of Anna Mauritia, eldest daughter of Philip III and Margaret of Austria, the future Queen of France, and also the future Queen of France, the little princess held a large branch of coral. In a powerful illustration of evil eye law in practice, the intense red of the coral stood out against the rest of the image, instantly attracting the gaze. This was an essential inclusion at this stage of life because children, and especially young children, were a prime target for fascination. As Plutarch noted, we know that some men, by looking upon young children, hurt them very much, their weak and soft temperament being wrought upon and perverted. This was echoed centuries later by many writers, including Covarrubias, who said on the topic that children run a much greater risk of danger than men for being so tender and having such thin blood. In the case of the portrait of Isabel Clara Eugenia, the coral and Magdalena were mutually reinforcing apotropaic elements which powerfully attracted the gaze and imbued the image with the requisite protective mechanisms. We see the same circularity imbued in the composition as the Antioch mosaic. The eye is instantly drawn by Magdalena, her rosary, and the monkeys. It is then drawn to the cameo and the Infanta's face, only to be pulled back to Magdalena again, who represents a continuous competitive tension for the eye. What would otherwise be a stiff and wholly symmetrical composition is thrown off balance by the inclusion of this small attendant to the side, which throws the viewer's gaze into flux as a result. The eye is thus pulled around and around and around the image, but never allowed to fully rest on the Infanta. But the question is, why might this have been necessary for this particular representation of the princess? That, it seems, has a lot to do with symbolic assurances of vitality and fertility, something critical to hereditary dynasty, especially at a time when the Spanish Infanta, an oldest daughter of the king, remained unattached. To understand this, we must take a small detour into classical mythology. The natural form of coral with its wavy branches was symbolically associated with the serpentine hair of the Gorgon Medusa and its intense colour with the spilling of her blood. When Perseus went to kill her, he used his shield to turn the Gorgon's deadly gaze upon herself and then decapitated her. According to Ovid, coral sprang forth from the place where Perseus set her head down on the seaside. And this is depicted in Pierre Mignard's representation of Perseus and Andromeda. Georgius de Cepibus described these life-giving qualities of coral specimens gifted to the Roman College in 1653 and displayed at the Cercera Museum. In the 1678 museum catalogue, he stated that it is characteristic of this plant that it emits a spermatic liquid, and on any object in its path upon which the droplets alight, new coral plants will bring about the birth of their own progeny in that same place. The emphasis on the prodigious virility of this underwater plant with its spermatic liquid so fertile that wherever it landed, new plants would spring up, reveals aspects of coral's inherent power related to reproduction that underpinned its perceived effectiveness against fascination. So virile it was that it was used on soldiers' breastplates and helmets to protect them in battle, as seen in the Louvre sculpture here and even in the vision of Constantine in the Vatican. Attracted to those who enjoyed good fortune, abundance, status, wealth, or beauty, the evil eye posed a direct threat to fertility, fecundity, and procreation. Therefore, strategies to scare it away, nullify its power, or cure its effects drew on symbols that reflected these potent generative forces. The symbolic life-giving properties of coral were therefore deployed to counter the death-bringing force of the evil eye. The fact it is a dwarfed figure in the vision of Constantine who holds aloft the helmet with the visage of Medusa and incidentally revealing part of his genitalia reinforces these symbolic associations between people of restricted growth and evil eye lore. This is most illuminating when we consider a portrait like that of the Spanish Infanta. As the oldest daughter of Philip II, Isabella Clara Eugenia was an important member of the family whose primary purpose was to marry and sire children to bolster the vast network of Habsburg power. When represented with Magdalena Ruiz, she was around 20 years old. By this time, her younger sister, Catalina Michaela, had already married and went on to have 10 children in her 11-year marriage with the Duke of Savoy, eventually dying in childbirth at just 30 years of age. By contrast, and despite ongoing negotiations proposing Isabella Clara Eugenia marry her cousin Rudolph II, he remained undecisive and her future uncertain. Rudolph's mother and Philip II's sister, the Empress Maria, had this portrait commissioned, hoping it would entice her son to make a decision. At a time when her future was still undetermined, unmarried, childless, and advancing in years, Magdalena Ruiz was an important symbolic inclusion, assuring the princess's vitality and future fertility at an uncertain juncture in life. If we fast forward a few decades, I'd like to double-click on another fascinating image from the Habsburg court, that of Prince Balthasar Carlos with an unidentified small-statured attendant. This image is singularly important because it is believed to be one of the very first representations of the heir to the Spanish throne and son of Philip IV. The little prince was highly anticipated and filled a desperate void of offspring that had intensified in the decades since the royal couple first consummated their marriage, and where all 4 children they sired before him had died in infancy. The image represents the delicate balance between the need to present the heir as healthy, strong, and capable like his formidable forefathers, while taking care to ensure his health and well-being were not compromised. Just as we saw with the image of Isabel Clara Eugenia, the portrait contains visual conventions and devices which firmly place the prince as a member of a powerful dynasty and within a long line of illustrious kings. This includes his baton and red sash of command. He wore a gorget or almond collar, alluding to the role of military commander. Even the gold brocade of his costume echoed the patterns on the armour worn by his forefathers. This was essential to visually link the prince to a long line of illustrious kings. Standing upright with an impressive expression and emotional composure far beyond his years, he was already being presented as a future king, something so essential to projecting an image of unwavering stability and dynastic continuity, especially at a time when cracks in the Habsburg hereditary monarchy were already starting to emerge. Yet when compared to other images of royal infants, it would seem these overt militaristic inclusions in an image of a child so young were quite novel. While the form of his dress aligned with typical infant attire worn by children of both sexes up until the age of around 5, preceding sons of Habsburg kings were presented with more age-appropriate and subtle allusions to their future military powers, like Diego Felix here, who was the son of Philip II, who is shown with a spear and a play horse. Diego Felix also wore amulets typically worn by young children to protect them from the evil eye, including a red coral heart, a cross, 2 medallions, and a horn or tooth, sharp objects believed especially efficacious in the face of fascination. In fact, it was common practice for young children to be laden with such apotropaic objects known as dijes, which were designed to protect them from the evil eye. And it was equally common practice for their early portraits to depict them exactly like this. Against a backdrop of dynastic instability, brought on by a long absence of an heir to a young and newlywed couple, presenting Balthasar Carlos in the full vulnerability of his youth was clearly not an option. Yet the young prince still required protection. Velázquez resolved this representational dilemma in an entirely novel way. He presented the prince in a manner that was deceptively aligned with established portrait conventions, yet managed the delicate balance between projecting the prince's future power while recognizing his current fragility. Velázquez's solution to this challenge lay in the figure with dwarfism. He moved typical apotropaic markers seen in portraits of royal infants to the prince's small-statured attendant. This included a gold rattle, not simply a plaything, but an important object used to ward off evil forces. He also wore a string of azabache beads around his neck. Azabache or jet, much like coral, was a powerful amulet used to combat fascination. And he also held an apple that was symbolically apotropaic and prophylactic. The obvious apotropaic significance of these objects becomes abundantly clear when we contextualize the portrait of the prince within the long-standing tradition of Spanish infant portraiture as seen in the examples here. The image of the prince was in fact a tour de force of evil eye lore based in and around the figure with dwarfism. As seen in earlier examples, this small figure was placed off to one side, disrupting an otherwise symmetrical composition, destabilizing the gaze and thrusting it into a circular spin. Velázquez emphasized this even further by bringing the small figure forward and physically placing him in between the prince and the viewer. Not only did Velázquez make doubly sure this figure would attract, distract, and fracture any malicious gaze before it could reach the prince, he also turned this figure into a physical barrier through whom the viewer must pass in order to access the image. When we read such images with an understanding of evil eye law, we see contemporary beliefs and practices come to life before our very eyes. And it seems the evil eye was indeed hidden in plain sight all along. With that in mind, I'd like to return to Las Meninas, and instead of telling you what I think, I would really love to hear your impressions about what you see now.
Okay, I'll have a go. So the dwarf then takes on a larger significance, knowing what we now know, what you have just explained to us, and is meant to be, I guess, a kind of protective force, not a plaything as I had assumed her to be, but rather she has a much more important role of protecting the Infanta than it would appear.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Your earlier observation, Philip, was very much in line with when these figures are commented on in the literature, they are typically characterized in the way you had assumed, which was they're a plaything or they're a pet.
Yeah.
They were, and they were absolutely in the court, in the function at times as entertainer. It's not easy to completely separate. But even in literature on the jester, for example, there is some work, particularly that's come from literary scholars, that talks about even the function of the jester as fundamentally protective in this kind of capacity in distracting, diverting attention, so it's not so intensely laid upon the king.
Catherine?
Yes, Susie?
I was wondering if you could say anything, if there is anything to say, about sometimes the small stature people are either directly looking at the viewer or not. And is there anything around that you can talk to about why that would be? Number one. And number two, it's looking at all the gazes. The painter is, whether he's got some protective role, because he's very distinctly looking out at the viewer. It's an amazing painting, but it doesn't look like to me like that's just his caught in a moment. It looks like he's very distinctly looking out. Maybe in some protective role, I don't know. And you're saying the painting the background is actually a mirror, and so where we're standing, the viewer is actually probably the king and queen being painted. Is that correct?
Yeah, so you've made lots of awesome comments, Susie. So in terms of the gazes, this picture is just so unique. But in the context of the work that I have done, if you sort of put it in context, Velázquez is obviously clearly highly innovative, but all of those innovations are anchored to core visual traditions. And what he does here in this particular picture is he's bringing a number of those traditions together. One of which I haven't had time to touch on today, is religious imagery. So I touched on it lightly in relation to the Infanta, but predating Spanish portraits, royal portraits, which include these figures, significantly predating, are a whole plethora of religious imagery, particularly the adoration of the Magi images, which have these small figures positioned in almost identical kind of ways on the side of the picture, but they're part of the entourage. They're often bearing a gift, like the Menina is doing here, kneeling, bringing one of the gifts to the Christ child. So this image actually has sort of some roots in a number of visual traditions that I think what's innovative here is that Velázquez brought it together in a single picture. And so here, and it's commented a lot in the literature around sort of the gazes and, what is the meaning of the gaze, and who's, is it the king and queen? Are they standing in our place as the viewer? Is that what the mirror is reflecting? Is it reflecting the painting on the canvas? There's an extensive debate on this kind of stuff. But I actually think, and your point about the gaze is absolutely right. A large number of the figures in the painting are looking out at us. And there's an intensified level of flux in this image where you stand in front of this picture, and after a while you just you sort of don't really know where to look, because this dynamic that is created through this sort of barrage of gazes. And so from my point of view, I think, Velázquez has sort of extended upon this concept of protection. This picture, it's really important. At this particular point in time, there was no male heir to the throne. There were discussions about marrying Margarita to Louis XIV. He actually married the older sister from the king's first marriage, which made more sense because she had a French mother. But there was a lot of things in flux. The king was aging. He was deep in his 50s, I think, at this point in time, he was deep in his 50s. And there was sort of very little hope. It's also symbolically significant. These rooms once belonged to the heir to the throne, and they eventually became the artist painting rooms. But this actually was the prince's quarters. So there's a lot in this picture that's both kind of quite sad in terms of reflecting the state of the monarchy at the time. Now I'm just trying to remember. Because you commented on so many other things. Did I miss anything that you commented on?
And the more that you're talking, the more that I'm looking at it. It's amazing. I suppose that, and you did touch on it, the painter looking at, I think, in a protective way, and also the gentleman at the very back. I think it's sort of like a triangle between the painter, the gentleman at the very back, and the dwarf. It's a triangle of sort of protection between those three. And then I was looking at also to the dog. That's an interesting gaze too. Like it's almost like in a position of humility, the way his snout is down, his eyes are closed. I find that an interesting, but that might be, there might be a artistic, historical thing to say about that too.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And the dog, so part of, again, didn't really dive into this today, but it's extremely common for the figure with dwarfism to appear paired with a dog. Mm-hmm. So to your point here, him reposing like this is a little bit novel, a bit different. But the combination of these figures together in the front, typically the front corner of the image. So they really are the entrance point to the work. So the first thing you look at really compositionally when you walk into these pictures or you step into these pictures, is often this combination of the dog and the dwarfed figure. And that convention comes straight out of religious compositions, particularly pictures of the adoration of the Magi.
That's beautiful.
Can I ask what we should make of the fact that the person with proportionate dwarfism isn't looking out towards the viewer, but is instead directing their gaze and, frankly, their foot at what appears to be a long-suffering mastiff? Should we read something into that?
Yeah, it's a good, actually, and that's the other point that Susie raised. So the gaze. So quite often in pictures where these figures appear, you will find that they are commonly the only figure in the picture to look out, directly engage the viewer. So this picture is a little bit unusual because you have a whole barrage of gazes coming at you. But equally, as you mentioned, Susie, there are times when they're not necessarily looking at you, they're directing your attention to something. In this particular picture, so Nicolásito had proportionate dwarfism, and you can see the light, that stream of light along the side of the picture. That's actually a window. And again, I didn't have time to put it all in, but when you go back to pictures like the mosaic with the dwarfed figure and the much suffering eye, these kinds of images were habitually found in vestibules, so entranceways, over doorways, and over windows. So anywhere where there was a sense of threat or transition, liminal spaces where this threatening force might enter. And it's really important to remember that this was seen as a real phenomenon. It was written about in medical treatises by doctors. This is, the way we think of it in modern terms is like sort of a superstition, but it really wasn't seen like that for centuries. And so these were kind of spaces that were a threat. There was a level of exposure. Now, the fact that he is presented, and he's the only figure in the image who is not presented wholly. He is part outside the picture, part inside the picture, and he is on the threshold of the window. And so, again, his positioning there, I would argue, is very reflective of evil eye law and practice, and these kinds of ideas of protecting these liminal spaces. He, sort of, as I said, part sits outside the picture, part sits in. So the combination of Maria Barbola staring you down and him coming in and, kind of drawing attention down to the dog, again, it's these sort of distracting elements. I also talk about, there are definitely links, and sort of to Philip's commentary before about them, being kind of court entertainers or pets or sort of amusements, that, there is reflections of that amusing role in the way in which he is sort of playfully kind of nudging this mastiff. He's distracting us in that playfulness as well. And that yet behind him, you've got Maria Barbola, firm and really quite formidable. Interestingly, she's definitely not framed in, there is some interesting research that's come out about her as being quite senior ranked in the Queen's household, particularly the Queen, Queen Mariana here at this time. I'm thinking, fast forwarding, she was in the royal household for a very long time. She came from Germany, so she spoke the same language as the Queen. And so there's been some interesting research about the fact that she may have actually held quite an important position in the Queen's household and was in fact of, some, or had earned some rank and status.
Can I ask really fascinating and interesting talk? There are a few things that I'm intrigued by. Essentially, we're dealing with, it would seem to me, the power of magic and dark magic in everyday life in 17th, 18th century Spanish culture. If we're looking at, this is the end of the 17th century, so the belief in witchcraft and witches is still very prevalent among most European cultures. So this in some respects is a commentary on what might be described as these superstitions, but they are also customs that are deeply embedded in peasant culture throughout Europe at this time, but which seem to have been adopted by the elites, when in other parts of Europe, by the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, elites are turning away from what might be called these peasant customs and having a much more rational view of the world / scientific view of the world. It's the beginning of the Enlightenment, after all. So that's my first sort of comment, query, if you like. And the other thing is, do we find this kind of symbolism in other European court paintings at the time, or is it uniquely Spanish? And finally, if we look at the bigger picture, and I think you've alluded to this in your talk, what does this really say about the preoccupations of the Spanish monarchy at the time? What are these paintings telling us about the state of the Spanish monarchy / empire?
Lots of questions. Which one do you want me to start with, Philip?
Up to you.
So in terms of, this idea of superstition and magic, and I basically had to draw a line. There were so many lines of inquiry with this search, but there is undoubtedly linkages, obviously, between things like witchcraft and so forth and so on. And in Spanish culture, I can't remember the name, they had a particular name for a particular type of child stealing witch. So there was this belief that, my partner's Spanish, and his mother was raised in a tiny village and believed they had a witch that could turn into a cat at night. So these kind of beliefs that, like you say, in terms of wider popular culture have been long enduring. But what I found really fascinating is that I really haven't gone down the witchcraft kind of path, because I said I had to sort of draw a line in sand in terms of where I research. But I think what's really compelling is when you look at these, the religious relics. So like this rosary, and it's not a one-off. So this object here that you're looking at, this here is called an eager. So it's a hand formation that is made specifically in protection against the evil eye. It's called the fig in English. And they're typically made of azabache, the jet material, but you'll also find them made of coral and various other amuletic substances. Incredibly prominent in the Spanish culture, but you'll also, this might speak to your second question, also find it very prominent in the Italian culture. But objects like this are fascinating because this is a religious rosary to which they're attaching seemingly profane protective objects, right? So, and again, there's further lines of inquiry with some of this. I've really just touched the tip of the surface, but there is, I think intellectually we separate this, but if you think about the daily practice of life, these kinds of objects demonstrate that these kinds of practices and beliefs were just so seamlessly interwoven together in the day-to-day of life that I don't think people even saw it like that. And so that sort of, and also there's crossovers with these kinds of objects and obviously the cabinet of curiosities. And, for example, as part of my research, I was in Innsbruck, and the collection there is fascinating. I mean, they've got cabinets and cabinets and cabinets of coral. And so, the way in which they looked at and saw these kinds of things, both as medicinal, protective, occult, it's not always easy to categorize. I can't speak readily to other courts in terms of, the belief that you sort of talked about in terms of, because I really haven't dived into it, but I can say in Spain with the change of regime at the end of the century, individuals with dwarfism were effectively ousted from the court. We see a significant shift, like you reflected, with the French Bourbons coming into the Spanish realms. But coming back to your second question around other courts, part of my early research, I have found hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images with people with dwarfism in them. It's quite, when you start looking, it's quite shocking where they pop up. So they definitely appear in imagery from other courts. Again, I sort of I haven't done like a fully exhaustive search, but for example, in Italy, they pop up. So that Vatican image, for example, you'll see them in lots of imagery from Italy. There are some academics who've worked in the space of these individuals in the context of Renaissance imagery, and they're framed a lot more as objects of ridicule, kind of an ironic, humorous element in images, sort of designed for an erudite audience to kind of work through and decipher. I think when you look at, and one of the things I did look at was contrast between kind of the kind of images you see in Spain versus other courts. In Spain, these figures are confined almost exclusively to portraits and religious pictures, and very particular religious pictures, most commonly the Adoration of the Magi. In Italy, you're going to find them in sculptures. You're going to find them in quite large paintings and pictures. Like, you find them in a much vaster range of subject matter. But you still see this kind of positioning in pictures. And so, for example, so here the figure in the front of this fresco, which is in a reception room, one of the Pope's reception rooms in the Vatican. The convention is exactly the same, and the apotropaic symbolism in this figure is just jaw-dropping. Medusa, again, I didn't go into that, but her visage has been used for centuries as apotropaic against the evil eye, because it's that idea of the eye versus the eye. She's got the petrifying gaze, and so if I turn that on the fascinator, and so this helmet that he casts above his head, the fact that his phallus is partly shown, there's a number of things in here that are distinctly apotropaic but gone completely undetected. And so and there's some other images in the Italian context, again, that I would argue are the figures are unquestionably, fulfilling this function. And belief, I think it's called the malocchio in Italian. Again, it's a big part of their culture. Not sure if I've answered the question. And the preoccupations with the monarchy. There is no doubt, like as you move deep into the 17th century. So even here, when this picture is painted, as I said, the royal couple had really struggled to sire a healthy child. They married at quite a young age. At this point in time, the marriage had been consummated for at least a decade. They had 4 infants die before he was born. So that sort of, looming threat, this prince, he died around the age of 17, I think. And so in the 40s, it was just a disastrous decade for the king. His wife died, his heir died, his favourite was ousted. And so by the time you get here, he's obviously remarried to his niece. His older daughter from his first marriage was, and Margarita are his only 2 surviving children at this point. And in Spanish hereditary monarchy, the females, it's like the worst case scenario to pass it to the daughter. And so this picture in particular is painted at a time where the monarchy is literally teetering on the edge of extinction. And, we know that when we get, hang on, where did I go? So this is the king's, he was born not long after Las Meninas was painted. You can see him here. He's covered in amulets. He lived only a few years. And then eventually they had, Carlos II, who was so riddled with, medical conditions as a result of, basically 2 centuries of inbreeding. He was sterile.
Okay. So a lot of insecurity around the succession.
Yes, I think anyway, yes.
Yeah.
I'm just a little mindful of the time. I'm afraid Ryan's going to come out with his big gong and gong us any moment now. So if you'll please join me in thanking Kath for an absolutely fascinating paper. That was
Thank you.
Just fantastic.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, it was great.
Just before you go, a reminder that our next event is at the unusual time and day of Monday, the 30th of March from 12:30 to 2 p.m. in L326 in the library, and that event will be in person only. And at that event, our usual chairperson, Ryan Strickler, will be launching his book, Early Byzantine Apocalyptic Discourses, Coping with Crises in the 6th and 7th Centuries. And I'm sure Ryan is very grateful to the current President of the United States in making apocalyptic crises such a present and pressing issue. And I'm sure there's much we'll all be able to take away from it. So we hope to see you there.
Yeah. Hopefully, if nothing else, it sells books, even if it destroys the rest of the world. So. Thanks for that, Sasha.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Philip. And thank you, Susie, for listening.